Mr. Deepak, who would be interacting with you, is someone who we want to engage in a sort of a longer period of time through ideas. And that is one of the things that I'd mentioned to the team. So a lot of the faculty who are here. So as we end perhaps the session, I would request whenever you're speaking or some of you are engaging, just make sure you can introduce yourself and mention about also the work that you're doing or what you're engaging in. Thank you. Sakib, please proceed.
I welcome you all to this Ideas Distinguished lecture. We have our guest here. The topic is on the trade policy and impact on the country's companies and livelihoods. The speaker for the event would be Mr. J.S. Deepak, who is a retired IAS officer. So has worked in various sectors, particularly in the telecom and trade sector. He's been secretary, has worked in different states, in UP and mostly North India. And Mr. Deepak is currently the group director of Bharti Enterprises, and he has a diverse career spanning within various roles, particularly the economic and telecom sectors, and served as the secretary for Department of Telecommunications. He was very instrumental in the 3G spectrum auctions, and as he told us, he was one of the person who designed those auctions, and he was the person who held those auctions. So he has been permanent representative of India to the World Trade Organization and held several other key positions related to trade and economic policies. So we also have a discussant for the talk. The discussant is Professor Prabhash Ranjan, who is Professor and Vice Dean Research of Jindal Global Law School. So I open the floor, Mr. Deepak, for his talk. So please.
I'm also part of one of the initiatives here at Ideas called Molding Methods, where we try to think of what interdisciplinarity means, which the center is about. Also part of a constellation called Culture and Media Studies. Thank you.
Hi. My name is Shaman, and I teach at the law school, and I work in the area of history of economic thought.
Hello, I'm Gayatri. I also work with Ideas as a faculty member.
Hi, I'm Abhinita. I also work with Ideas as a assistant professor, and I have joined, I'm part of a constellation here on climate change, livelihoods and sustainability, so I'm quite looking forward to your talk.
Shomindra, I am an assistant professor, a colleague of Ideas, that's all.
Student, I'm Dhwani, and I recently studied international trade law. So.
I'm Prabhash Ranjan, as I was just introduced. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Abhishek. I am an associate professor at Jindal Global Law School. I teach economics. My areas of research are open economy, macroeconomics, and currently I am doing a research on India's industrial policy.
Hi, my name is Chisom. I'm a colleague of his in the law school. I also teach economics. My area of research is in development, poverty, and I'm writing a paper currently on trade between India and Africa. So this is going to be very interesting for me. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Pravalini Tiwari. I have done my master's from Jindal itself in arbitration, mediation and all. And personally, I'm working on peace building and I'm planning my projects there on mediation. Currently in Jindal, I'm heading Department of Comparative Examinations and I'm supporting students for that. And I basically wanted to understand the economic aspect of dispute resolution and understand the perspective on that to be here.
Hello, I'm Virat Sharma from Office of Doctoral Studies, Jindal Global University.
Hello, I'm Kirti Sachdeva. I'm working as a manager here at Ideas office.
Good morning, sir. I'm Gaurav Gupta. I work as a manager in general administration in the university. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipanshu, Prabhash, all of you. It's a privilege to be here at Jindal Global University Office of Interdisciplinary Studies. When you look at, when you have a word called interdisciplinary, one knows how difficult it is because in government we are always struggling to break silos. And I can imagine what it requires. So it's a pleasure to be here, especially have an occasion to interact with bright young people like you on a topic of burning current interest, I'd say. You know, trade policy profoundly affects economic activity and relations across the globe. But after Trump 2.0, as we call it, it has become even more overwhelming and important. Today we will discuss how this policy affects countries, trade policy affects countries, companies, as well as individuals. And I would like to take you through this through a number of case studies, real-time, ground-related experiences, which show how trade policy can impact industry, business, trade, as well as livelihoods. And I'll try to bring it to you from the point of view of a practitioner, having been a negotiator for India and having worked on various assignments related to trade as well as globalization. Now, the presentation outlined broadly is looking at how trade rules have affected and led to the liberalization and the rise of China, how the information technology agreement, which was one big trade policy measure of 1997, led to the death of the electronics manufacturing sector in India, how infant industry production to make India a small car hub was a success story, how global value chains for assembly of smartphones and creation of jobs is being run in the country, and how TRIPS and Indian generic pharma industry's role, what was the role, how it delayed finding a success for the HIV, handling the HIV/AIDS pandemic, then coming to agriculture subsidies and its impact on livelihood of farmers, and finally the current trade war, the whys, wherefores, where will we go, and what are the prospects as well as challenges and opportunities, including for India. So it's a little technical in the sense that it relates to trade regulations, it relates to trade negotiations as well as policy, but the impact is real on companies as well as on livelihoods. Before I get into the meat of it, let me just try to introduce you, since you are from a variety of backgrounds, to a few trade policy measures. You know, tariffs, we hear so much of tariffs in this Trump era. Now, tariffs are a tax on imports of goods or merchandise, which are to be paid by the importer. Now, trade rules and commitments made by countries at the WTO or through FTAs determine what is the maximum amount of tariff you can put on a particular good that is traded. For instance, India has committed ceilings for various things. Apples, we can put a maximum of 50% of the value of tariffs, and similarly for various products which are traded. The ceiling is fixed. Within the ceiling, you have the flexibility to change the tariff rates. Then there are quotas. Now, quotas represent the maximum amount of a good which can be imported into a country. In the pre-1995 period, there were developed countries like US and Europe imposed quotas on textiles and clothing. They limited the amount of imports of these things which were generally produced in developing countries. And that had a negative effect on market access which exporters from these countries could get in these geographies. In the Uruguay round of negotiations leading to the setting up of the WTO, the quotas were generally, textile quotas were abolished, and today quotas are generally considered as WTO non-compliant. Then there are non-tariff barriers, which are widely used by many countries as protectionist measures. Standards, you hear everywhere. There are standards for quality and safety meant to protect human life, environment. But they are a double-edged weapon. They can help improve quality of manufacturing or food or other products in a country. At the same time, they can act as barriers for accessing raw materials and intermediates which may be required to produce goods. So they have to be used in a calibrated manner. India uses a lot of what is called quality control orders under the Atmanirbhar Bharat program, which lay down quality standards for various items. And these, while meant to improve the quality of manufacturing, are often a hurdle in getting state-of-the-art raw material from abroad. Then there are various types of controls which countries use. Rules are becoming increasingly important. Tariffs have always been important, but their importance is growing down. Rules are becoming increasingly important as part of trade between different countries. And there are two or three kinds of rules mainly. Rules of origin. What is a product that is manufactured in a particular country? That is determined. For instance, the US uses a requirement of substantial transformation. So if a clothing item is made in a country, the cloth has to be from the country and it has to be stitched in that country. Only stitching alone will not make it an Indian good if the cloth is coming from outside. The rules of labor, minimum wages, environment, and investment are something which are now being increasingly proposed by the US and so-called gold standard FTAs, which are meant to, which are in sense also trade barriers. And finally, we have rules on digital trade, which are to be brought onto the books. Now, in the US, Mexico, Canada FTA, for instance, the rules require what will be the minimum wage in an automobile factory in Mexico. So it does have an element of extraterritorial enforcement as well, which many countries like India do not agree to. Finally, there are agriculture subsidies and incentives which can affect competitive advantage of trade. If a country is able to subsidize its agriculture products, they can be sold cheaper and affect farming in the country to which the goods are going. And there are incentives like the PLI scheme which India uses. Lastly, the exchange rate is an important aspect. By adjusting the value of the local currency with the US dollar, which is the currency of international trade, you can subsidize exports or make imports more difficult. By devaluing, you make exports cheaper. By increasing the value, you make imports cheaper. So countries like China have been using exchange rate as a measure for years to manage trade. Tariffs, which is the flavor of the season, have a history which has been there for some time. Before the early part of the 20th century, when there was no income tax, no direct taxes, tariffs were basically a source of revenue. Governments used it to get revenue for public programs. In the GATT era, that is in the 1990s, when the WTO was set up, they became an instrument for level playing field. So if a country was providing subsidies, another country could have entitlements of tariffs to protect its domestic industry. Developing countries and least developing countries have entitlements for protecting domestic industry and agriculture by use of tariffs, and they have entitlements for higher tariffs than many other countries. In the early part of the 20th century, 1930s and thereabouts, tariffs were used as a weapon by the US to reduce imports of agricultural products from Europe. These were under the Smoot-Hawley Act, which are the name of the two members of the House of Representatives, to restrict imports, and they are believed to have led to the recession and the depression of the 1920s. And finally, in the Trump first term, 2017 to 2020, tariffs were used as a negotiating tactic. You increase tariffs, do a deal, declare victory, and come back to the old position. In Trump 2.0, which is the second term, all tariffs are being used for all these purposes. source of revenue. He wants to give a direct tax holiday to the rich. So alternate source of revenue, instrument for a level playing field. He talks of reciprocal tariffs. Others should bring the tariffs equal to the US. Weapon, of course, and for negotiations and getting deals for the US. What we need to remember is that the US actions of raising tariffs are unlawful. They're illegal. The US has committed ceilings on tariffs at the WTO, and they cannot increase the rates beyond that. What they have done is illegal as far as WTO, which are the international trade rules, are concerned. And the fact that they give exemptions and make exceptions is also a violation of the non-discrimination or the most favored nation principle of the WTO. With this short background, let me go to the impact of trade policy on China. Now, China in the early 2000s, it joined the WTO in 2001, was promoted by the US as a poster child of liberalization. President Clinton, who was the main proponent of this, said that liberalization of China and bringing it into the WTO will open doors for trade, doors for new trade opportunities for America and new hope for change in China. So they were wanting to make the totalitarian system in China more democratic, as well as get a market for American companies. Even before that, George F.W. Bush, the US president, said, no nation on earth has discovered a way to import goods and services and not while no nation in the world has developed the method of importing the world's goods and services while stopping foreign ideas at its borders. So the idea was to increase trade as well as to open up China. US consumers, of course, also benefited with low-priced Chinese goods, with choice. Corporations profited immensely. Exports of US increased 4.5 times. But there were certain alarm bells raised by the labor unions. Between 1999 and 2011, 12 years, the US lost 6 million jobs, out of which 2.5 million were related to China and 1 million of them were in manufacturing. So the outcry that you hear now was something which was anticipated and which was expected, and which Mr. Trump is using to change the narrative. But the main benefit went to China. China was able to become a factory of the world. It brought 800 million people in China out of poverty. You know, extreme poverty is defined as per capita $1.9 per day for household. It decreased from 67% to 1% in China, mainly because of trade and trade policy. 800 million people in China came out of poverty, and foreign direct investment really increased. GDP per capita increased. If you look at this figure, GDP per capita income of India and China was about the same from 1980 to 90 to 2000. In 2000, with liberalization, the figure for China just shot up. And today, the per capita GDP of China is over $12,500. As for India, it is about $2,500. So it's a factor of 4.5 times as much. So trade policy can make certain very significant differences. Looking at FDI and exports, same thing happened. These are some figures of exports from India and from China. You see the figures for China just cascading, as well as the FDI stock. Professor Kelkar has estimated that between 1997 and 2019, about 22 years, China got 12.5 trillion of foreign direct investment, whereas India got 460 billion. So China got 25 times as much of FDI, which went into manufacturing, infrastructure, etc., and explains the rise of China as a higher middle income company today. The Other aspect of China has been internal reforms. You know, infrastructure, productivity in manufacturing led to it moving from low-tech to high-tech manufactures and exports. It started with textiles, leather, using the wage arbitrage, but today is a leader in high-tech industry like semiconductors, like solar cells, like electric vehicles, and so on and so forth. Poverty reduction we've talked about. China today is a part of global value chains, and we will discuss this a little later in more detail, for most high-tech products. And because of this, it gets the benefit of exports even from other countries. The virtuous cycle of investment, production, exports, creation of jobs, surpluses, and those surpluses being plowed into the economy has led to this phenomenal growth of China, which is about 5 times in the last few decades. After liberalization, after trade policy, which was looking outward, which reduced tariffs, made investment easy, and enabled foreign companies to participate in growth and manufacturing. Of course, industrial subsidies, along with the low cost of utilities, also has been responsible for China's competitiveness, and even today are important. So China leveraged its market initially, low wage rate, then brought in state-of-the-art infrastructure from foreign direct investment, used a decentralized model of quick decision making, but today its USP is basically skills. It is, as far as skills are concerned, the most advanced nation, and this is topped up by subsidies and management of the exchange rate. And finally, scale. The scale at which Chinese companies operate is indeed mind-boggling. Chairman Mao, the leader of China, once said, "Quantity has its own quality." He was, of course, talking about the army. If you have a large army, it makes a difference. But as far as industry is concerned, if you look at BYD, many of you might have heard about BYD, the electric vehicles manufacturer. They're setting up a factory in Zhangzhou. 50 square miles is the area of that factory, 5 miles by 10 miles. The size of San Francisco is the area of the factory. Manufacture 1 million vehicles a year, 2.6 million people employed there. I mean, that is the kind of scale they operate on. They built a ship. BYD has built a ship. 9,200 vehicles can be put on a single ship for exports. So scale is something which they've leveraged for comparative advantage and competitive advantage. One ship, one time, 9,200 vehicles, cars. I mean, it's amazing. So the short point is that trade liberalization, when late 1970s, when China decided to liberalize, it's basically the trade policy which has led to all these very fundamental changes, whether it's reduction of poverty or expansion of GDP per capita or investment or the quality of life and so on and so forth. So it can have transformational rather than incremental benefits. Let me now look at a second case study. This is related to India. Information Technology Agreement was a WTO agreement which was signed in 1997. Many of you, it's before your time, many of you would not remember, but India had a thriving domestic TV, computer, and video games industry. You know, there were names like Western and Onida and like Keltron and Uptron, very thriving companies catering to Indian domestic electronic demand. Today, you don't see them. They're non-existent, wiped out. The ITA agreement was meant to liberalize trade in IT products like TVs, computers, solar equipment, software, semiconductors, optical transmission equipment, telecom equipment, those kinds of things, including the parts required for the manufacture of these and for testing of these. So about 200 products, the duties were to be brought to zero, and India reduced duties in 2000 and 2005 from about 30–40% to zero. The result was that imports came in from more competitive manufacturers. Those who were ICT exporters benefited a lot. Trade went up. But as far as India was concerned, it wiped out our industry. The domestic demand for consumer electronic products has gone up from 10 billion in 2005 to $25 billion. But the percentage of domestic production fell. You know, the global, as per the OECD TIVA database, the value added decreased from 70% in 1995, before the agreement was signed, to 45% in 2005 to 34%. So our share in the electronics market, domestic electronic market fell from about 70% to 35%, while the market itself expanded by 2.5 times. So a measure which was meant to increase global trade in ICT products, it did increase, had a very negative effect on Indian electronics industry. So that it's not like, trade policy is not always beneficial. Liberalization is always not beneficial. We say free trade is good, but fair trade is also important. And this is a case which illustrates how a trade policy measure can lead to devastation of an entire industry sector. Let me look to a positive case study from India. You know, India used tariffs for infant industry production to make India a small car hub. In the late 1980s, after the Maruti experiment, a phased manufacturing program for automotives was implemented in India. The idea was to put tariffs on imports of cars and car parts so that they would be manufactured domestically. And there were requirements for increase of domestic local content in the products, as well as foreign exchange balancing requirements. So you could import raw materials or components of the value of which you would export. It had to be neutral. These were non-compliant with India's commitments and the WTO rules, and the US and EU took India to dispute in the WTO. Ultimately, we lost the dispute. But what happens in the WTO is the disputes take time. You know, it takes 3–4 years before the process is over. While the US and EU took India to dispute and won the case, the Japanese and the Koreans decided to invest in India. And we had the Hyundais and the Toyotas and the Hondas coming in. DSB, the dispute settlement body of WTO rulings, are prospective. So in the 5 years, using the labor arbitrage, a core of domestic automobile industry, manufacturing, assembling cars and manufacturing components was born in India. Then the FTAs with Japan and Korea added to this. The way the Japanese and Koreans negotiated the FTAs, they allowed, they got duty-free import of special steels which are used in cars, of engines, etc., which were not manufactured in India, used the Indian labor arbitrage, and we were able to build cars which were globally competitive. So initially, these cars catered to the domestic market, but later on they were exported. And today, high tariffs prevent car imports into India, and our small cars are competitive, and we export 7.5 lakh cars every year. In 2024, we exported 7.5 lakh cars, including to Europe. So with a trade policy measure like the phased manufacturing program, which was declared illegal and struck down by the WTO, we were able to lay the foundation of an automotive industry in India, and it has now become a small car hub. So trade policy, carefully calibrated, can make a great difference even in the manufacturing sector. coming to global value chains, many of you might, we will have enough time for discussions, but if you have a comment or a question which you think is compelling, please stop me and we can have a discussion anytime. Global value chains is a word you might have heard in the context of trade. Now what happens is design, production and assembly of a lot of products can be disaggregated to different parts of the globe. And parts of the same product can be manufactured in different countries. Computer-aided design allows codification of design and standardization of components, and multinational corporations who are the leads of GVCs are able to standardize production and assembly. What happens is a product like a smartphone may be manufactured in a dozen countries. It starts with a chipboard in one country, then components are added, moved, assembled, packed, tested in different countries till it becomes the final product. For this to happen efficiently, and this will happen in countries which have the most comparative advantage in that particular area, whether it's basic manufacturing or assembling or packing or whatever, if the product can move in and out of the country freely. So it requires almost no tariffs, and it requires trade facilitation. So zero tariffs and trade facilitation measures play an important role if a country has, or a company from any country has to become part of a global value chain of a product. Till we had high tariffs, it was difficult to manufacture smartphones in India. By calibrating tariffs, now we've become a source for assembling smartphones in India. So it makes a difference. Further, after the pandemic, when lots of countries put restriction on imports and exports, there's also a geopolitical advantage and disadvantage of global value chains. Near-shoring or friend-shoring, getting components from countries which are your friends or near you is advantageous because the supply chain does not get affected and it's safer and more resilient. Similarly, if it is in a country which is geopolitically not aligned with you, that country may put export restrictions like China is putting on semiconductors now as part of the trade war and make it difficult. So these are aspects which affect global value chain. But the basic point is that today some studies suggest that about 70% of trade happens in GVCs, and for developing countries especially. It is important to become parts of important global value chains if you have to become rich before we become old. Before our population ages, we need to use our labor arbitrage and other arbitrage to create wealth and jobs. One example of a successful entry of Indian companies into global value chains is the assembly of smartphones, which has created a lot of jobs. In 2014-15, when this government came, in the name of creating a level playing field, a duty of 7 to 10% was imposed on cell phones. So cell phones imported became expensive. It became viable to manufacture them in India, mostly assemble, but so-called manufacture. And initially, the tariff was on phones. Later on, when phones started getting assembled, tariffs were put on components. So components started getting manufactured in India, and the value addition increased. And today, subsidy under the production-linked incentive scheme has made it even more viable. The impact has been phenomenal. In 2014, there were 2 factories which were producing smartphones in India. Today, there are 200. Earlier, the value of production was 30,000 crores. Today, it is 2,70,000 crores. Only 10% of smartphones being bought in India, being used in India, were manufactured in India in 2015. Today, 98% of smartphones being used in India are manufactured in India. And we export about 10 billion a year. So it's really helped flip it. So trade policy measures like tariffs can help if used in a calibrated and a directed manner in triggering the growth of manufacturing, assembly, and becoming part of global value chains. However, here I'd like to add a word of caution. Today we say that India exports $10 billion of smartphones. if you have an Apple iPhone, which is sold in US for $1,000, and if you break it down, $450 is the royalty which Apple charges. $450 is the cost of components which come from China mostly, and from some other countries. $50 is retailer margin, etc. So India gets only $50 out of $1,000. So the value addition is low, but is gradually increasing as more and more components start getting manufactured. And even the assembly is not something to be scoffed at, because it creates a lot of jobs. Clean, pollution-free jobs for skilled workforce, mostly women in the electronics industry. The next example I would give you is from the area of public health. In February, on 7th February 2001, the New York Times had screaming front page headlines saying, Indian company offers to supply AIDS drug at low cost to Africa. It created a furor. You know, Cipla, an Indian company, had introduced a low-cost generic, what it called triple cocktail, a mix of 3 drugs, which was pivotal moment, which was a transformational moment in the global fight against HIV/AIDS. Before this, American and European multinationals were providing AIDS, drugs related to HIV/AIDS, at $1,000 a month in Africa. $12,000 a year was the cost. With the introduction of this Cipla triple cocktail, the cost came down to $1 a day, $365 a year, from $12,000 to $365 a year. You know, HIV/AIDS is not treatable, but by providing a mix of medication, you can prevent, it's called antiretroviral, you can prevent its growth. It almost stops growing, and complications are prevented. So this triple cocktail took care of that, and it made effective HIV/AIDS management accessible to millions in Africa and developing countries around the world, including Southeast Asia, etc., which were suffering from an HIV/AIDS pandemic. And it led to a campaign for global access to affordable medicines. Now, why I say this is looking at a trade policy measure in the area of intellectual property rights. You know, intellectual property rights are, or the TRIPS agreement, which relates to intellectual property, is not about liberalization of trade, and so it should never have been part of the WTO. But it was the pressure of the developed countries who wanted the protection of the WTO dispute settlement system for IPRs, which got it in as part of the Uruguay round agreement. Professor Mohan Kumar here, he used to be a delegate, Indian delegate, which was part of the negotiations of the Uruguay round, and they could not stop this from coming. This was the cost which India paid for higher entitlement of tariffs and other benefits which we got. Now what it led to is, it led to patenting of both product and process invention. Earlier in India only process was patentable, products were not patentable. So what companies did is, they used a different process to get to the same product, and you would always have a generic drug at a fraction of the cost of a multinational drug of the same formula. With TRIPS agreement, generic version, you know, patent protection is for 20 years. For 20 years, you cannot produce a drug, a generic version, till the patented product is in the market. So this led to monopoly profits, supernormal profits for big pharma, prohibitive cost of antiretroviral treatment, as I have mentioned, and monopoly rights adversely affecting public health across the globe. And it was only when these drugs went off patent could a company like Cipla manufacture a generic version and make it available. The same problem we noticed during the COVID pandemic of 2020-23. While vaccines were available to most developing countries, therapeutics and diagnostics, diagnostic kits and therapeutics, medicines for treatment of COVID-related complications were not available except the branded ones being sold by big pharma at exorbitant costs, which could not be afforded by people in the third world. So the entire global south was in a way deprived of therapeutics and diagnostics, while they have late but some effective access to vaccines, because many of the multinationals who developed these vaccines got them manufactured in countries like India. So, yeah.
Recently, I saw that Indian cough syrups are banned by many African countries on bad quality. So, what's the intervention on this? Because this is very much related to the TRIPS agreement.
It's related to the availability of generic pharma and low-priced medications and affordable healthcare around the globe, not directly to TRIPS. And quality is an issue which is a separate issue. You can make generics, a generic product, when there is no patented product, and a patented product's life is 20 years. Many companies and countries, basically US, Switzerland, etc., are trying to do what we call evergreening of patents. By minor modification in the patents, they want to increase the life. So if a patent is coming to an end in 20 years, they will make it, like SR. If there's a drug called ASR, strong relief, specialized release, they make minor modifications and apply for another patent for 20 years to keep generics out. That is a TRIPS issue. Quality is an issue. Quality of drugs manufactured in India and exported have had lots of issues in Africa and South America, in Europe, where they have shipments have been blocked and sent back. But it's a different issue. It's a quality control issue. Today in the US, 70% of drugs prescribed as part of the insurance-supported health programs are generics. And 70% of those are imported from India. The US ensures that only quality drugs go. So quality control can happen even for generics. Bad quality can even be for patented drugs. But those require separate processes, and they have relate to issues like profiteering and lack of controls, lack of regulation, lack of enforcement, and so on and so forth. So the point is that a trade policy measure to protect intellectual property, to reward innovation, to lead to invention for healthcare can have an adverse consequence of raising prices to an extent that becomes unaffordable for huge percentage of the world population. And this is something which India leads in fighting for the right to make generics through various measures, including compulsory license, etc., which many of you who are associated with the legal aspects of trade may be aware of. Agriculture is another area I'd like to bring you. It's right, this debate on tariffs has brought in the fact that many countries have large tariffs. But what is got hidden is that tariffs were given to us, entitlement for tariffs to many developing countries like India were given, and in Africa were given as a counterbalance to the high subsidy, agriculture subsidy entitlements of the US, Europe, and Japan. Today, India can provide 5% of the value of 10% of the value of production as subsidy for any good. So if we produce wheat, 10% of the value of production can be subsidy through minimum support price or through various other measures. In the developed countries, they have dollar-related, dollar-level entitlements. So the US has 19 billion, EU 72 billion, Japan 32 billion. It's called the amber. But the difference is that they can put this on a single crop. So if you have cotton, US can give theoretically $19 billion of subsidy to its cotton farmers, which will enable them to reduce cost of cotton, and if they export it to India, our cotton farmers would be destitute. They would not be able to sell the product. So it's the entitlement plus the structure which gives the advantage to the developed countries, which they have got through the rules that they have made in the Uruguay round. And developing countries have been fighting for this. But the short point today, which I would like to make, is that our tariff entitlements are not something which we've got by sleight of hand, as President Trump would like to say. It's not something which we've stolen and got caught and now are being forced to reduce. It is to balance the Uruguay round commitments. Now, what happens with the huge subsidy entitlements of the US? They have a possibility of undercutting prices of dairy, poultry, cotton, and fruit grains. In Europe, you get subsidy depending upon the land you own. The Queen of England owns 3 million acres of land. She gets a sum per acre. She may grow anything in it. She may have dairying. She may have nothing. Leave it barren. That entitlement is there. So if you are getting a fixed subsidy depending upon the acreage, you can produce an agriculture product, underprice it, and have a competitive advantage and sell it in developing countries, whose farmers will not be able to compete. So landed price of milk in Burkina Faso at one point was 50 cents a liter, half a dollar. And domestic dairy industry got wiped out because they could not produce dairy at that price. New Zealand is a great example. New Zealand, people think, is a small country we can do an FTA with. And New Zealand has 5 million, a population of 5 million people. It has 5 million cows. Each cow produces 12 liters of milk a day. Each human consumes 2 liters. So they have 10 liters surplus a day, which comes to something like 50 million liters a day of surplus, or an annual surplus of 18 billion liters of milk. They are able to convert into various produce, and today New Zealand controls 25 to 30% of the global dairy trade through their cooperative Fonterra. So what they can do is they grow, their cows are on pasture. They don't do stall feeding. They just use sprinklers for growing grass. The cows feed on it. There's no variable cost. For a farm of thousands of acres, there may be 2 or 3 people employed. Everything is automated, including milking of the cows. They can trace the milk to the cow, with the result that they can increase or decrease the production in no time. So if the demand increases, they can increase the number of cows on the pasture. If it decreases, they slaughter the cows, sell the meat. So they have an immense possibility of dumping, which makes dairying in countries like India, etc., very vulnerable. And poultry, the US has 3 years of chicken drumsticks in cold storage. They eat breast meat because they eat with fork and knife. In India, chicken legs, as they call it, drumsticks are prized. They sell drumsticks at 60 cents a pound. So if we do not put non-tariff barriers like we put on import of these, they can sell chicken drumsticks at 200 rupees a kilo, when chicken in India is being sold at 400 rupees a kilo, and really hurt the poultry industry. Very strong in Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, and the South generally. So these are again trade policy measures which can impact livelihoods of farmers in these kinds of occupations. Lastly, coming to the trade war, let me just try to share you, since it's many of you would be aware of what's happening, what happened in trade war 2018-24 during the Trump's first presidency. A general feeling is that it hurt China. So these are some of the figures. The apparent impact of the trade war on China was that the exports from China to the US came down by 5 percentage points. So apparently they were hurt as the imports declined dramatically. Also, the items on which the US put tariffs, the imports into the US from China went down and imports from the rest of the country went up. 35% down from China, 35% up from the rest of the countries. Again, it appeared that tariffs were working. Sources of imports from the US, China decreased by about 6%, and Vietnam, Taiwan, Canada, Mexico, India, and South Korea made up for it. So these countries, whatever the exports reduced from China, were made up for exports from these countries. So apparently changes in source of US exports. But if you dig down deeper into the data, what actually happened? This is what we call the redirection of Chinese goods to the US. Exports from Vietnam to the US went up by about $6 to $7 billion a month. And if you look at it, exports from China to Vietnam also went up by the same amount. It's a mirror image. So Vietnam became, they extended the value chain. It became an intermediary country to export to the US to avoid the rules of origin. And actually, the trade war had no impact on China, in the sense that the total exports of China in 2024 were more than what they were in 2018 of the products on which the US had put tariffs. By extending the export chains, by interposing intermediary countries, by making investments for manufacturing in those countries, especially in Southeast Asia and Mexico, China has been able to reroute its products. Instead of going directly to the US market, they're going to third countries. So they're very well prepared. With this background, let me go to what is happening. The narrative of Trump 2.0.
So just
yeah.
So in this process, this country has Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam. They also benefited because some manufacturing was also set up there.
Yeah. See, they benefited. China did not lose. These countries did not lose dramatically. These countries benefited. Like Vietnam benefited, Taiwan benefited, India benefited. iPhone manufacturing came to India. Still 50% of the iPhone I mentioned, if it's a $1,000 iPhone, 50% is coming from China. India is adding $40. So we are benefiting in the sense we are creating jobs and some investment is coming here. But what is being shown as an export of $1,000 from India has only $40 to $50 of value addition in India. So these are benefiting. The benefits are marginal. The major benefits are still going to China, the manufacturer, and the US, the intellectual property right holder.
Now, my one question here is, like India, the major beneficiaries India had was in terms of only assembling or low-end manufacturing. Yeah. Was it also the similar for Southeast Asian countries?
By and large, in the sense, in Vietnam it was deeper because Chinese companies were able to make investments there. They set up mirror factories. What was being manufactured in Guangdong started getting manufactured out of Hanoi. So they were able to get we also tried to increase this. You have my iPhone. When I was Secretary of Electronics, we called the Tatas. We said the 4% value addition on iPhones is too little. This back cover is a metal cover of iPhones. It costs $10. We asked the Tatas, why don't you start manufacturing this? You are experts in metals and manufacturing. It took them 3 years. Now they're doing it. It took them 3 years to be able to manufacture the back cover of iPhone. So, it's not easy to shift the component ecosystem. It requires skills which are there in China. Tim Cook says that the advantage today of China in the tech industry is skills. It's not, labor costs have gone up. So textiles and other things, the flying geese thing which many economists would know, are moving out. But yes, but high tech is there because of skills. He says if you are looking for skilled people, you won't be able to fill a room this size in the US. In China, you can fill football fields. So now the major USP in China is skills and scale. Scale I mentioned in the context of BYD. The skills are there. And they are manufacturing components. You cannot transfer the component system easily because India, for instance, we have what is called the Press Note 2 of 2020. We don't allow investment from China for security reasons. Now, Apple, USA is not going to invest in China. Apple China can invest in India so that we manufacture here to cater to the US market. But we don't allow those investments. Now the government has realized that that is shooting itself in the foot and some kind of relief is being given in the case-to-case approval. But the point is that China has been able to get around this issue of tariffs better than most countries. And it has not got hit the way the US thought it will hit it. The second point I'm coming to is new narrative. Trump says injustice because you have higher tariffs, we have lesser tariffs. I mentioned that this is regarding the level playing field against subsidies. Now, what is likely to happen in the trade war 2.0? US has made demands. I believe that they will sign deals and declare victory like they did in the first trade war and go back. You know, during 2018 and 24, when I was in Geneva in the WTO, there was a lot of noise. But then they signed a deal with China where all the tariffs were almost brought down to the same level. China committed to buy soybean, corn, pork, beef. Because China understands the vulnerability of the US is their farming community. So today, in the second war, they have put restrictions on imports from China, from US on agriculture. See, what does US sell to China? Oil, gas, pork, beef, soya, and corn. These are the main exports. All of these can be got from other countries. What does China export to the US? Smartphones, computer tablets, computers, semiconductors, electric vehicles. It is difficult to shift manufacturing of those in the short run. So China has a strong advantage. I'm back from the US. I was lecturing in a number of places, including Wharton. They are downbeat. They believe, at least the liberal and the leftist intellectuals in universities believe that they are going to be beaten in this trade war because China is so well prepared and because of the structure of trade. So what is likely to happen? It will become a political thing. He has created a demand. He will sign a deal. He will get something, maybe 5% or 10% of what he's in. He'll declare victory and things will be as usual as we have seen. China is not going to be affected. But other countries, including India, have a problem because we don't appear to be so well prepared. But that's another story. Also, China is taking the space which the US had of promoter and protector of a rules-based system. Now, China goes to the WTO for disputes. It is saying that multilateral rules are being violated by the US, which they are, and they want them. So what the US has created, promoted, protected for the last 70 years, that role is now being appropriated by China. Isolation of the US is another thing which is happening. You know, if you look at the recent trade agreements, Ruchir Sharma has pointed out that recently, in the last 10 years, EU has signed 5 major trade agreements, China has signed 6. If you look at the dynamic trade corridors, 5 of them out of 10 have one end in China. Only 2 of them have one end in the US. So US is getting isolated as far as trade corridors and trade agreements are concerned. And China is obviously better prepared. What about India? What are the opportunities and challenges for India? I mean, very brief, we have the highest entitlement of tariffs. So we are at greatest risk in this business of reciprocal tariffs. So my view is that we should try to keep the bilateral trade agreement that we are negotiating to as narrow as possible. A merchandise agreement, 0 for 0 on certain items, tariff reduction, tariff adjustments, etc., etc. Protect agriculture, poultry, dairy, grains from US imports by not reducing tariffs on that. Protect our market access in areas. What do we export? We export textiles, we export pharmaceuticals, we export light engineering, automotives, certain agriculture products like shrimps and spices. Protect those, agree to a 0 for 0 duty if necessary. And most importantly, keep trade rules out of it. You know, tariffs are still manageable. The kinds of gold standard rules which the US demands, you know, digital trade rules, where you cannot put digital taxes, where you cannot have localization of data, where you have other constraints, environmental rules like CBAM of the EU, where they put taxes on your imports on grounds of environmental standards, labor standards, which take away our labor arbitrage. These are the things we should fight to keep out and not try to make it a broad-based, deep, macro, broad-based agreement, including agriculture, as Mr. Lutnick, the US Commerce Secretary, calls it. That we are negotiating with India a broad-based, grand agreement, including agriculture. This is not, I think, in our interest. I think I will stop here with a very brief, I've taken much longer than I intended to, but very brief to just summarize. Trade is not like the incoming tide that lifts all boats. These examples will show it can be an engine of growth as well as a disruptive force. And one of the reasons for backlash against free trade has been that it has hurt industry. It hurt Indian electronic industry. It has hurt US steel industry. Cities have got devastated because steel making in US has become non-competitive because of imports from China, and it's causing this backlash against free trade. Second point, trade policy choices need to be made. Prioritization is essential. You cannot protect everything. Using a chess analogy, you may protect the queen and the king and the knight, but you have to sacrifice some pawns. So if you want reduction in tariff in textiles and auto and things, you have to reduce tariffs as part of the negotiations, a give and take. Third point, market access is increasingly possible by being part of global value chains. A strategy is required for this, for us to become part. Fourth point, trade wars can affect trade, growth, jobs, and even lead to recession, as the US is experiencing. They have a reduction in production of 1.2 percentage points in last month, and they're expecting a recession. So trade wars are easier to start, more difficult to end. They can snowball and lead to a recession, even have led to depression. Lastly, skillful negotiations are required to protect livelihoods when we negotiate a bilateral trade agreement with a giant like the US. And we have to be careful to be able to leverage trade policy to our advantage. And ultimately, I'm optimistic. I hope that truth and trade will trump bullying and bullshit, which Mr. Trump is trotting out all over the place. Thank you. Thank you. So, welcome comments, questions, whatever else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to probably pass the baton to Prabhash. Please, Prabhash. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipanshu. Thank you, Mr. Deepak, for this very interesting talk. I have a few sort of questions or few footnotes to add to what you have mentioned. And I speak as an international lawyer. I'm not an economist. So my first question or thought is on the cell phone industry or the smartphone industry, which you mentioned as a success story. So my question is that if India were not to be given these production-linked incentives to these companies that are assembling smartphones to India, would we still have this kind of growth? Because this is something that economists like Raghuram Rajan, for example, have argued, that you're throwing money at these rich guys, and if you claim that anyway foreign investment would come to India, right, because you are the fastest growing economy, etc., then why do you need to subsidize this kind of production? So that's just my first question, which you may like to answer. I would like to add a few footnotes to the fascinating trip story that you have depicted, and again as an international lawyer. As Mr. Deepak rightly mentioned, this 2001 AIDS crisis led to a lot of fundamental changes in the international IP regime. In 2001, we had what is known as the Doha Declaration on Trips and Public Health. And this Doha Declaration would not have come about if this furor in Africa on the AIDS crisis had not happened. Now, what that declaration did was to reiterate the flexibilities that are already present in the TRIPS, but were not being understood or interpreted in that fashion. So just to give you an example, the TRIPS agreement does not, contrary to what many people believe, the TRIPS agreement does not restrict the right of a country to issue a compulsory license. In fact, a country has the freedom to issue a compulsory license on any ground that it deems fit. The only obligation that you have under Article 31 of TRIPS is that if you issue a compulsory license, you have to follow certain requirements. Say, for example, you should have first tried to get a voluntary license, except if it's a national emergency, you should pay adequate remuneration to the patent holder. But what are the grounds on which you issue the license? This is not mentioned in the TRIPS agreement. TRIPS agreement is silent. This was being interpreted at that point of time by big pharma lobbies as saying that, no, you can't issue a compulsory license unless until you have a dire situation of a public health emergency. But this was clarified in the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health that countries have the flexibility to issue a compulsory license on any ground. There was also, there's another problem in Article 31 of TRIPS agreement, which basically says that if a country has issued a compulsory license, the drugs produced under that license should be predominantly for supply or usage in the country that has issued the license. So this is 31F of the TRIPS agreement. It says predominantly for usage in the country issuing the license. This created a problem for many African countries which were relying on India, because they don't have manufacturing capacity, they don't have a vibrant pharmaceutical industry. So how do they make use of a compulsory license as a flexibility? Now, if they ask India to issue a compulsory license, India will then not be allowed to export the medicines produced under that compulsory license. So this then led to adoption of another decision in 2003, which was a legal solution to this problem, which basically said that countries that do not have the manufacturing capacity can request a country like India or any other country that has the manufacturing capacity to issue a compulsory license and export medicines. Now, fast forward to the pandemic, Corona pandemic, and Mr. Deepak would know this very well, that India and South Africa had proposed a TRIPS waiver, a very comprehensive TRIPS waiver for Corona pandemic, not just in terms of vaccines, but also diagnostics and therapeutics, as he mentioned. This waiver, finally, when it was adopted, I think it was not even 1/10 of what was proposed or what was advocated by India and South Africa in October 2020, if I remember correctly. So unlike the 2003 decision, right, the TRIPS waiver, the COVID waiver basically says that it is only for vaccines that you can issue a compulsory license. It does not apply to therapeutics, diagnostics, etc. And developed countries are out of it. In other words, developed countries can't be approached by an African country to issue a license for a vaccine. So that again limits the ability, the pool from where any country can get a vaccine. Countries like China have opted out. Countries like India, which were very enthusiastic about this initially, but for some reason didn't show the same enthusiasm towards the end. Many IP lawyers had argued that once you have the TRIPS waiver, if you want to implement it, you will have to make changes in your domestic IP law, which did not happen. So which clearly shows that once this was adopted, many countries like India perhaps lost interest in this. So that's, again, an issue on which I would like to hear what Mr. Deepak has to say. The evergreening question, I think, which Mr. Deepak mentioned is very important. And just a footnote, in the Indian Patent Act, we have a section called Section 3D, which is basically a bulwark against evergreening. So as he mentioned that, many times pharma companies would do incremental innovation and would then like to extend the period of patent protection by another 20 years. Section 3D actually puts a stop to it, right? It says that you cannot get a new patent only by incremental innovation, right? If you look at the USTR reports that come out every year, and this is again a fear which many people have talked about. The USTR or the US is very unhappy with a provision like Section 3D in the Indian Patent Act. Now, this Section 3D, in my opinion, is fully compatible with the TRIPS agreement. The reason being that the TRIPS agreement does not define what is novelty, does not define what is inventive step. These are requirements which have to be satisfied for a patent to be granted. Now, since these terms are not defined in the agreement, countries have the freedom, have the discretion to define these steps in a manner that suits their domestic needs. This is precisely what India has done under Section 3D. So in my opinion, it is fully compatible with TRIPS. Yet there is a pressure from US, and it has been there for a very long time, that countries like India should remove Section 3D. And I fear that in the negotiations that are happening currently, this might be one of the issues, along with agriculture and other issues, that you have to do something when it comes to patents on medicines. A quick comment on agriculture. Mr. Deepak is absolutely right that the rules on agriculture are biased against developing countries. Now, this is a thought which I want to sort of propose here. And one of the reasons why India is deeply concerned about the agriculture rules is because of the minimum support price that we pay to the farmers, right? Which is like a income support that you give, a price support that you give to the farmers. Now, let us flip this around and not saying that the rules are fair, but let us assume that if India were to say that, okay, fine, we will give a subsidy to farmers, but it will not be linked to, it will be an income support. A good example of this is the Pradhan Mantri Krishi Nidhi Yojana, which was launched in 2019, under which farmers get 6,000 rupees a year, although it's still 6,000 what it was 6 years back. So again, I would like to know what Mr. Deepak has to say on this, that can India think of moving towards that, right, away from MSP? I know this is politically very, very dangerous, politically very, very risky, because agriculture is a very sensitive issue, right? We know the agitation that we saw on the 3 farm laws, although many people say there were some features in those 3 farm laws which are actually good, but just that, you can't sort of shove a reform down the throat of the people. So if India thinks of moving towards that income support kind of regime, would that be beneficial? I don't know, just a question. But of course, India has to continue fighting for reforming the agriculture agreement. And one way to do that is to cut down or to sort of say that that 10% subsidy cap should not be there, or at least the reference price or reference year, which is fixed to 1986, should be moved to a more realistic year, closer year, given the inflation that has taken place. Finally, on the question of trade war, which Mr. Deepak mentioned, and this is something which is very contemporary, and on this I would like to present a view of an international lawyer, which perhaps very few people talk about, at least in India. Now, let's get few things straight. Mr. Deepak mentioned this, that Trump's reciprocal tariffs are a complete violation of WTO law and international trade law that we have. I think there has to be a candid, open acceptance of this. And this is where I have a disagreement with the government, that the government hasn't been very clear in saying that, yes, this is a violation. What we do with that violation is a subsequent step. But we first have to call out the US for violating trade law, right? And say it as it is. This is something which has not happened. Now, what are the things that US has violated? Of course, MFN, because US is now saying we have reciprocal tariffs, so we can impose a higher tariff on country X and a lower tariff on country Y, depending on what tariffs they put on my products. This is a textbook example of discriminating between countries, right? So it's a violation of MFN. It's also a violation of another provision in GATT, which is Article 2, which basically says that countries have agreed to a bound tariff rate. That is the tariff rate beyond which they will not impose tariffs. Now, when Trump says that I will impose any tariff that I like, they are not honoring their own bound tariff commitment. So it's violation of Article 2 of GATT as well, and violation of several other provisions. Now, in order to counter this, there is this talk of striking a bilateral deal, and we all know, at least I know from the media, that India and US are negotiating for a bilateral trade agreement. I agree with Mr. Deepak that it should be a narrow agreement, right? A broad-based trade agreement with the US perhaps will not be in India's interest, given our sensitivities in agriculture. But there's a legal problem that I see here. And I need to flag this. And the legal problem is that since India and US both are members of the WTO, can they sign a narrow bilateral trade agreement without complying with the requirements of Article 24 of GATT? So, 2 WTO member countries can sign bilateral trade agreements. It's not prohibited. But when they sign a bilateral trade agreement or a free trade agreement, the name doesn't matter, the nomenclature doesn't matter, the substance of the agreement matters. They have to comply with certain requirements. And one requirement is that this trade agreement should cover substantially all the trade between the 2 constituent countries. Now, if it's a narrow agreement, which will be extended or applicable on a non-MFN basis, which means India reduces tariff rates on whiskey coming from US and doesn't do that on whiskey coming from EU, for example, then India is violating MFN. Now, this violation of MFN can be excused if India can make a case under Article 24. But for that, the trade agreement has to be consistent with Article 24. And if it's a narrow trade agreement, then it would not be consistent with Article 24. Now, have people in India or in the government thought about this? I'm sure they must have thought about it. And what is their solution to this, or what is their reaction to this? One reaction could be that anyway, WTO's dispute settlement system is dysfunctional. So let any country go and challenge it, and even if we lose at the panel stage, we'll appeal in the void, and then the matter will never get resolved. But I don't think that a country like India should be favoring that kind of approach. This is an approach which a legal realist would love, right? But I don't think a country that has always championed a rule-based trading order should have this on their mind. So therefore, this is a problem that I see. Also, a final point. Recently, there was a statement issued at the WTO by around 40 WTO member countries in support of multilateralism, in support of a global rule-based trading order. And I was very surprised to see that India was not a signatory to that statement. I mentioned this in my piece which I wrote in the Hindu, that India was not a signatory to that statement, which is very surprising for a country that has always championed a rule-based trading order, right? Have we given up on the rule-based trading order? You know, when we are asked questions about US legality, we point to Chinese legality. Yes, we can contest Chinese legality, but let's also call out the US for blatantly violating the trade law. So I would like to know what Mr. Deepak thinks on this. And final point, you know, the joke is this, as Mr. Deepak mentioned about, you know, US trying to get China to WTO in 2000 and hoping that with trade there will be import of ideas as well, right? Democracy and rule of law, etc. Now what has happened 25 years later is that China hasn't become democratic, but US has certainly become more totalitarian. Right? I'll end on that note. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prabhash. I mean, perhaps there would have been no better way of also, I mean, not just summating, but the very pointed, precise range of questions, which I think takes the conversation forward. Let me just intervene, if I may, just to enable everyone else here who may have some questions or comments. Let us collate them all together, and I can then probably say that you have 10 minutes towards the end just to be able to respond. I know that might be less, but we can take the conversation forward to lunch. Any particular questions, queries, comments that anybody else who has to offer? If none, then that enables me to, yeah, okay. Gayatri, do you want to go ahead? Yeah,
thank you so much for that fascinating talk, because it's so insightful when it comes from people with so much experience of doing all this for their life. And so I have a lot of questions, but I'll limit to one comment and one question. Comment is on how futuristic China is with respect to the increase in patenting that's happening, or like a kind of higher educational sort of a research oriented boom also that's happening. I was connecting this with respect to the iPhone example you gave, where like one chunk goes to China with the manufacturing, the other chunk goes to the US with the intellectual property rights. There could be a futuristic situation in which that intellectual chunk would also be going to the China. Is that a future we are envisioning? If this is this is how the world order is proceeding. And the other question I have is with respect to the weakening Europe. What is that doing to the dynamics now that there's no colonialism to save Europe? What is there? What will happen with the weakening Europe with respect to production? And thank you so much.
So my question is respect to these PLI schemes that you talked about, and the smartphone industry being a very wonderful success. But overall, if we look at the PLI schemes and the objectives with which it was set up, the PLI and both the Make in India in 2014, the objectives that it said, they increase the manufacturing sector contribution to GDP by a certain percentage, which we never reached near about that, and now the government has shifted that to 2035, that a certain percentage, about 25% of our GDP to come from manufacturing is now shifted to 2035. Even in fact of the total PLI schemes, if I look per se, while it's only few years up in the post-COVID that it has been implemented more, the objectives again, the increasing number of jobs or the amount of total production that it would like to export, because export orientation was one of the major keys of PLI schemes. Neither have actually reached the desired level of success. What do you think, sir? Where does our weak industrial base or coming up with this PLI schemes would be helping India to attain its objectives, which the government wants to enforce through these schemes? Because Make in India 2000, it's over a decade, and we were nowhere near the target that it had set up in 2014. In fact, this contribution of manufacturing to GDP has in fact gone down by a few percentage points.
Hi.
Nayan, and then Chisholm, yeah. And
I had a question on for example, there is this example of Indonesia and nickel exports, nickel ore, which basically they they banned mining of it and focused on downstream processing. So that means increasing their capacity to refine it, which was contested completely in the WTO. It ruled against it, while the Chinese basically helped them increase their capacity of refining and so on. So on things like this, where there is a question of resources, and then this is also relates to question of basically on the global value chain, where do you basically pitch yourself? And in that, where you mentioned basically India has to have a strategy on this level, where is India at on this question? Because for example, say chip manufacturing. Now the US is saying, oh, we will not go into China, look for other sources and so on. And India is saying, okay, we will do chip manufacturing. But chip manufacturing can be of any sorts. It can be like very high-end digital chips, or like even washing machine and so on. We are basically targeting quite low in the value chain is what I'm seeing. Is that true? And then what is the India's strategy on that? Because the global value chain, as it is concerned, it is basically design and so on. The greatest value added is on that level. Then comes the manufacturing, and then the value add, it is less here. So, yeah, the question on that. The second was on the kind of treaties when Chinese companies make with, say, US companies, when it had opened up in the 80s and so on. So there is this thing, I don't know how far that is true and if it is relevant to our concerns here in India as well, is that there are clauses of digital transfer and technology transfer as well, which means on one level, how did China achieve this level of skill? Of course, education and state intervention and so on, but also in terms of when companies collaborate, when certain MNCs go and invest there are clauses for technology transfer as well, which I'm not sure if India has it on that level and if state intervention is required on that level. Thank you.
Your personal opinion, what do you think is more important, free trade or fair trade? Assuming you can pick just one, I'm sure you're going to say a mix is probably the best, but I want to get where you lean. Do you think, which one is like the more important ideal to strive towards? That's kind of like my question.
Sorry, Abhinita and then Shomendra? Yeah.
India with a democratic process is of course different. So do you think the way the GDP has grown in China and the manufacturing and the trade policy they have mapped? And secondly, small medium enterprises and those laborers in agriculture and textiles, do you think what kind of policies India should have to protect their interests now in this volatile changing global trade policies?
That's the sort of roadmap for another seminar, which I think would need. Shomendra, maybe the last comment question and then.
Yeah, no,
Thank you.
That was quite a balanced presentation. I see a lot of presentation, but this is super insightful because the vignettes that you have presented talks of both ways. I am approaching this from a more economic geography perspective. My question, and it's kind of takes inference from Nayan's and Avinita's point of view. Our manufacturing landscape, I don't think is really fit for talking about global trade. 50% of our manufacturing workforce are in villages in India, as per the data. And a lot of these are one single owned enterprises, highly labor intensive. but the fruit of that labor intensive manufacturing doesn't add up because of the very fragmented nature of manufacturing. Now here the discontent with the China comes, where these kinds of manufacturing probably at the early ages have been linked better to the value chain. We have not been so far added to this thing, and that leads to the quality part that Nayan was largely talking about. So my entry point here is that a successful trade agreement needs complementarity of domestic production channels. How do you think India actually doing it in terms of linking back and forth to this? And not only like some big capital intensive manufacturing, but also like the forward and backward linkages that's been created in the small manufacturing case. The second large question I had was on services. Like I'd love to get your inputs that how service trade agreements situation and scenario is happening, given we are a major service powerhouse, but our service sector is also very fragmented. Like a big 70-80% chunks that we service, that we produce are traditional services, comes from transport, comes from food, accommodations, those kinds. Modern services are a selected part. We do well in that front, but what the trade policies say about regulating and mainstreaming that. Thank you.
Okay, I know that 10-12 minutes would be very low because you would have, I think, maybe 4 pages of questions. But what it does is also gives us a lot of food for thought on how the nature of engagement would flow from the dialogue like this. I just want to add one small, not question, but see, a fact that, and this is where I think your talk was very insightful, and Prabhash mentioned about this towards the end. With trade, a lot of the non-trade aspects of changes and the nature of those changes that have happened in political economy often have now got the meat of everyone's attention. As a result of that, there's a reverse engineering of that impact now on trade liberalization era, so as to speak. So what we called as the late 20th century global hyper-globalization space has sort of lost its meaning because of the nature of impact that era had. So I'm curious to know what kind of balance you seek. So I draw a lot upon sort of the political economists' work, like Danny Roderick and others, who argue that there is a more balanced need for understanding the nature of social and cultural dumping that happened with Chinese model of trade dumping, which was often drawn from a flying geese, Japanese and other Korean markets. Is this that Japanese did it in a very different way, the Chinese did it in a much more expansive manner to scale. So I'm curious in that sense, what other models from a political economy landscape does it allow us to take that forward? Because as we know of the late 20th century, that hyper globalization era, it seems to me the nature of politics would not really allow for it. The same applies to the rules-based order, which somehow I think got lost in a more expansive dispute settlement body anchored WTO, because where the GATT agreement framing was not well respected, and a lot of countries then moved away from rules to having more lawyers working on trade agreements and the language of those trade agreements. So there's this fascinating reading by Roderick himself on which says how trade agreements look like now. And I often take students to the WTO trade dispute site and say, well, can you look at from 90s onwards how the language of the dispute settlement mechanism has changed. So it's become increasingly law focused. So one is a sort of a broader macro question which is on the political economy, but the other is there been too much of focus on contracting and legalization of trade understanding, which has lost, I would say, a broader interdisciplinary meaning, making a lot of people confused. Right now, that's what I think Trump is doing. He can play around with words and say the tariff war is won, because actually nobody really understands how this thing works. And as we saw from your talk, it's not very difficult to understand. If you're a non-economist attending this, you can still make sense of what's really going on. So thank you.
Thank you, Prabhash, for those very interesting points that you raised, and for the very thoughtful comments and questions from around the table. I'm glad that this is provoking some discussion. That's why I put my email ID there. I may not be able to respond to all of it, but we can always keep a conversation going. Now, of course, Prabhash is a distinguished academician. He calls himself a lawyer, but we call him as a trade expert as well, so he has many hats. You know, the point about PLI subsidy and the criticism of Raghuram Rajan, and I'm aware of that discourse. I mean, I agree entirely. And I will supplement it when I come to answer your question about free trade versus fair trade or what should be. See, we cannot perhaps regress into a model which is, again, tariffs and subsidies. We have liberalized. The China example was to show an extreme thing where benefits of liberalization. India has also benefited. We've also raised a lot of people, but our trade engine is not firing. You know, consumption, investment, trade. Three things required to push GDP. Trade engine in India is not firing. We were stuck at $300 billion of exports, $550 billion of imports for a decade. From about 30% increase per year in exports and imports in 2004 to 2009, we came down to 3-4% increase from 2014 to 19. So trade engine is not firing, and unless it fires and unless we can leverage the global market, I don't think we can get the kind of growth rates which we aspire to. I personally believe we've already lost the battle to become even a middle-income country, leave aside a high-income country, but that's a separate debate. Now, the use of subsidies is, I think, necessary for level playing field. It should be an interim measure. When we put tariffs for smartphones, we realized that there was a disability which manufacturers in India suffered, which was about 7 to 10%. Cost of utilities, cost of finance, poorer infrastructure. So if you wanted to do, same person wanted to manufacture in Southeast Asia and in India, costs were 7 to 10% higher. So we put a tariff of that amount, put a wall, so that people could come and manufacture and get that advantage. The same thing has been augmented through PLI subsidies. Basically, when we lost the export subsidy case, this is a suggestion that was done that production subsidies are not WTO non-compliant, so try to clothe it. It's actually working out more as an export subsidy. But it cannot sustain. The only advantage I see in PLI, I believe that it is only assembly, and that's why I gave the example of need to add value. Unless we add value, it will be only job creation in a very costly way. So we need to go up by getting the components ecosystem here slowly, and through a calibrated use of tariffs initially, subsidies, but which will not sustain. The good thing about PLIs is that it is washed by the Ministry of, it's cash. So the Ministry of Finance keeps a hawk eye on it. Okay, you spent so many crores, tariffs people impose and forget. You impose a tariff and you forget it, and it remains forever. In the last 5 years, this government has increased tariffs on a third of all traded products. In 2018, Prime Minister Modi came to Davos, Mecca of globalization. I was an ambassador there. He made all the right noises and said what people wanted to hear about globalization, free trade, this, that, and came back and hiked tariffs on hundreds of items. So we used to say that free trade seems to be good economics. It certainly doesn't look like good politics. Because Trump came, and before coming, he hiked tariffs on washing machines, this, that, and the other. So they said all the right things, but they obviously their heart was wanting protections. So it should be an interim measure, both from the point of view of fiscal space as well as from competitiveness. But once they have got the benefit of 3, 4, 5 years, they should be able to compete globally. Regarding the point on TRIPS and public health, I mean, I think the TRIPS waiver, the COVID TRIPS waiver, which we were seeking, which India, South Africa made a proposal, which had global civil society support, including in developed countries, which had support from scores of nations and members of the WTO. I think it's a big negotiating opportunity lost that we let it go. We agreed to a EU proposal which was absolutely meaningless. We got nothing. See, the the problem in negotiations is, and I can say, having been chief negotiator in RCEP, in EU, EFTA, WTO, the developed countries are much better prepared and equipped. We call it the 3Ds, you know. Initially, they will deny. When you ask for a TRIPS, they say it's not required, you know. The TRIPS, the compulsory licensing arrangement has every flexibility possible. Once you go deeper and tell them, no, it's not possible because of you cannot export to countries which do not have much manufacturing capacity, this, that, and the others, delays, and then they will delay it, ask for more information. Third strategy is to deflect. I mean, why ask for this? In addition, we can give you this. You know, suggest an alternative which, again, puts it on a tangent. And finally, dilute it. And that's what they did with the TRIPS waiver. What we got was, I mean, lip service. It neither helped. So I think the understanding has to be that free trade is important. I believe free trade is, I mean, extremely important. But public health and certain other things are even more important. And, you know, as they say, access to health or livelihoods of farmers cannot tiptoe. Rules relating to these cannot tiptoe around trade rules. They have to be upfront rules which protect the livelihoods of farmers, which protect public health. And trade rules should not try to go around them, but try to reinforce them. That is what has to be there, and I think it will require, like the outcry, the pandemic resulted in an outcry which brought us to that level. I think if India had sustained and if it had said that we will not let go the electronics commerce moratorium, we would have got it. I think it was lack of nerves. But that's my personal thinking. The issue of agriculture. See, I am a strong supporter of MSP, which is a little contradictory because I'm also a supporter of free trade and liberalization. The farmers, especially small farmers, and 99% of our farmers by international standards are small and marginal. To get a decent return, not only require, I mean, prices are not, the market prices are not enough to give them a decent return. They require subsidies. A farmer sells everything wholesale, buys everything retail, and pays the freight both ways. As MS Swaminathan said, unless we don't even calculate the MSP using the full costs, C3. We calculate it as a very basic MSP because of our fiscal constraints. Unless you give him a protection, how does he compete with the others? Today, cost of production of productivity of cotton is the best in India. Cost per kg of cotton produced is the lowest in India. But the kind of subsidy that American farmers get, no competition. They can sell you cotton much cheaper if you don't have a tariff. So this, in order to balance the competitive environment, you require things like MSP. The third point was regarding the trade war. I agree entirely. The US is violating Article 1, which is non-discrimination, MFN. Article 2, which is bound tariffs. Article 1 and 2 of the GATT rules of 47. I mean, this is the oldest agreed trade rules. They need to be called out. They're telling a lot of lies which need to be contested, and the narrative needs to be corrected. The government, I agree, has been not addressed these issues. There was a time when this should have been done, and when I was ambassador and they imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, we immediately recommended that we should go to dispute and we should retaliate. And the argument was that it should be SOP. If someone breaks MFN and WTO rules, automatically retaliation and dispute kicks in. There should be no one to take a decision. It's just a mechanical thing. And then it's easy to defend. The Prime Minister can tell the President of the US, I can't help it, this is a normal thing, we'll negotiate it out. You have a negotiating thing of getting it back. We don't do that, we kind of fumble and delay and that. Not only the government, the media has been lax in not highlighting the fact that this is not an injustice done to the US. If you read what Fareed Zakaria says, the US has immensely benefited from this trade order. They created it, they protected it, they defended it, they promoted it, they benefited from it. Look at the per capita of US. It's now $80,000. Japan used to be 1.5 times more than US, now it is half of US almost. Europe used to be more, they are less than US. Top 10 companies by market cap, 8 of them are US, all tech companies who are using our data to glean artificial intelligence and sell it back to us or make money from advertisers and others. So they've benefited. This narrative of President Trump that India is tariff king, they have by sleight of hand got these tariff entitlements, now they have been caught and now they are being given a knock on the knuckle and they will be disciplined and forced to reduce. This had to be corrected. The problem is that we started negotiating the bilateral trade agreement. It's too late for the government to do that, but since the media is by and large eating from the government's hands, if I may say so in this closed room, they should be asked to do it. This is a narrative which needs to be corrected. Having said that, it's also important that you have negotiating issues. If you file a dispute, you can take it back. If you don't file a dispute, there's nothing to negotiate. We say, grandfathering is a term which we use in negotiations. If you have a law, then you say, we have a law, we can't do anything. If you don't have a law, you have policy space. Then they say you agree to this, you bind this down, you agree that you'll never do this, you don't do that. Things like data localization. I mean, during the G20 summit in 2019 in Osaka, Prime Minister Abe, who's a great friend of Prime Minister Modi, wanted free flow of data with trust. I was ambassador there, called to Osaka. We told the Prime Minister this cannot be done. We should keep our options for data localization, for enforcing data localization. We allied with South Africa and Indonesia. When he was convinced, he stood out. India, South Africa, and Indonesia refused to agree to a declaration, refused to sign off. And Indonesia took it forward and made a law. We still have not done it. We're talking about it, and we're planning to do it. And with the result that data centers from Singapore, Hong Kong are now migrating to Indonesia because they don't allow their data to go out. South Korea, they don't allow location-based data to go out. All this GPS, etc., is therefore South Korea-based. They've developed this industry. So we need to, one, take a policy decision, and two, go forward. This is policy space is to be used. You don't just take policy space and sit on it. That's what we do, and this is something which we need to look at it. Also the fact that the point he made about bilateral, it's true that WTO rules allow FTAs. It has to be substantially all trade. Substantially all trade is not defined. So what we do is we start a negotiation and do what is called an early harvest. We say we are negotiating a broad-based, comprehensive trade, investment, whatever agreement. The first tranche is we agree to these adjustments in tariffs or some minor things, as happened with UAE, with Australia. I mean, these are all, then good thing is that substantially all trade is not defined, and even better thing is that DSB is paralyzed. But as supporters of the multilateral trading system, I do agree we should not, though we have taken advantage of that in our subsidy cases where we lost on electronics as well as on export subsidies. Appealing to the void should not be the issue, but then we should, I mean, the system works against us, so if the rules allow it, we should game the system to our benefit. So I think we can do it. I mean, we don't have a choice. Ideally, in all my writings, I've said that India is ready for FTAs with everybody except with China and US. China, because it's the factory of the world, our industry will get swamped, and that's why I was a great supporter of withdrawing from RCEP. And US, because they insist on golden rules, which we are not in a position to meet at this point of time, whether it's digital trade, labor, environment, others, IPRs, others. Coming to the fifth point about, that's an interesting point about China not becoming democratic, but the US becoming dictatorial. This seems to be happening, unfortunately. But the good thing is that Trump, there is a silver lining in the sense that the way Trump has dealt with the world, there is a backlash against this kind of a thing. Look at the elections in Canada and Australia and all over the, I mean, there are people who had 3% chance of winning have won in Canada, 1% chance of winning have won in Australia. So this is a reaction that people believe that someone who's professing a policy like that is not some, we would not like to have that policy, and that policy is not good for us. So I think, suppose equilibrium will be reached. Some of the questions from the past participants, you mentioned about research in China. I do not agree with you that China will get tech leadership. I think they have already reached a level where they have tech leadership. In telecom, China is 2 to 5 years ahead of US and Europe. I work for a telecom company. I've been telecom secretary. The equipment of Huawei is far better than that of Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, the works. 60% of the cost. And the only way to keep it out of the market is to ban it on security grounds. Last resort of the scoundrel. There is what is called, and I think in the closed wall of this room I can say, there is what is called the National Security Directive on Telecom Services. Every quarter I attend a meeting with the NSA where we decide on trusted sources and trusted products for telecom equipment. All that we do in that meeting is, suppose Airtel wants to buy a particular equipment, Jio wants to buy a particular equipment, Vodafone wants to buy it. You say whether it has got Chinese ownership, Chinese manufacturing, Chinese components. And it turns out that there is no equipment in the world in telecom which does not have one of these three. So we give waivers. So Jio wants a particular set of routers. Okay, it is Chinese components, but okay, we give it waiver 2 years. Hopefully it will develop in India or it will develop in Europe and things like that. So they are way ahead. I was in the US last week, traveling by the underground, the subway. They give you, they tell you that the train is coming here, and A, B, C, D, second class is here, first class is here, etc. This they've been doing for years, and you say, okay, I'm second class, I'll stand here. In China, if you go, and I'm not talking of Shanghai or Beijing, you go to a third level city, you get the same thing. You get bogie-wise capacities. They have sensors in the coaches which tell how much is the weight, kitna khali hai. So I don't have to stand at B, I can go to C where 30% is vacant seats and this, that, and that. They are so far ahead in transportation and sensors and energy management, etc. that this is in telecom. EVs, Tesla cars, 300 miles, 400 miles is on charge. BYD is now 1,200 miles. They are doing a charge, many of you might be engineers, some of you at least, 1,000 volts, 1,000 amperes. In 5 minutes, you charge for 1,000 kilo. 5 minutes. We, as an electronic engineer, I wonder how do you maintain 1,000 ampere with 1,000 volts? The current gets divided in series. They do it apparently. In 5 minutes, you can top up the charge to 80%. So we have a company called Indus Towers, which was wanting to set charging infrastructure in India. That it will not be required. If that technology comes to India, everyone will charge in 5 minutes and that's the end of it. So they are way ahead in many of the things. Weakening, how much time have we've already crossed up? Let me take 5 more minutes and finish it off. Weakening Europe I think, it's in decline, it's very sad, but I don't think anything can be heard. They have lost the will to live. They have lost the will to work. They want to live it up, but they've lost the will to work, 3-day week, 4-day week, and so on and so forth. I mean, we have 2 companies. We have 24% stake in British Telecom. To get them to office is a challenge. 4 days a week, not even 5, 4 days a week. So I don't know what's going to happen. You mentioned about PLI, and see, manufacturing is not about subsidies or tariffs. I give you an example of Mr. Goenka. He was the chairman of FIO, Federation of Indian Export Organizations. He used to tell a story. As he signed up for a visit to China in 2010. Two-week visit as an industrialist. They're textile manufacturers, so he thought he'll go there. He said, I just thought of it as a sightseeing thing, but by the time I came back, I had a company registered. They had given me a bank account and license. He set up a textile factory out of Shanghai, which we visited, which is still running and then expanded. So decision making is so fast. I mean, infrastructure, skills, all these are recognized. Decentralization. When I used to go as additional secretary of commerce to China, they would always make me meet the mayor and the Communist Party person of the district. All this, they have their targets, but every decision, allotment of land, this, that, everything is taken at that level. So we have tried to copy the SEZs, state-of-the-art infrastructure, fiscal incentives, but decentralization and empowering the person to take all decisions, that we have not done, and that's why the delays. So, you cannot get manufacturing, it's so difficult to get anything done. I look at it from the side of industry. So no wonder the manufacturing has gone down from 16% to 13% of GDP. No increase in manufacturing exports, nothing. Auto is the only example where it seems to, and automotives today is 1/3 of all manufacturing in India is auto sector. 1/3, PMP, otherwise it's the only sector which needs to be protected and which is doing well. The data, you see the data localization, the Indonesian example, I mean, Indonesia has used trade policy to restrict and benefit in the case of data centers I mentioned. Also, manufacturing, there's this debate which we have between services and manufacturing. Because there is Raghuram Rajan, whom I respect a great deal. One area which I don't agree, he says India can be a services power. See, services cannot create the kind of jobs. We need 1 million jobs a month. We call it steel versus Starbucks. If you set up a steel factory, you get infrastructure, you get skills, you get high quality jobs, because also part of it is exported, you get a good value, and the scale is such that the factory will set up a stadium or a hospital, so that, the community benefits. If you set up Starbucks, okay, I mean, people come and there are certain jobs, but nothing. I mean, it's a very low quality job. So manufacturing is important, and we have still not found the way to free trade versus fair trade. See, I don't think it's versus. All economists through the ages, Milton Friedman says, all economists through the ages have been unanimous that free trade can create wealth and jobs. There can be no absolute dispute on that. Also, free trade appears to be good economics, but doesn't appear to be good politics, because our politicians are not buying. I mentioned about Trump and Modi. We have had a colonial legacy in India. I mean, Walt Whitman says that the bleeding of India through unfair trade has been the biggest tragedy of all mankind. And we lost out of wealth because of unfair trade rules, our textile, all our manufacturing and livelihood industries got disrupted for exports from UK. But, I mean, it's a necessary and sufficient condition. Free trade is necessary. Unless you open up an example of China, example of India after 1995, you have to have free trade, and then you work to fair. Fair is incremental, I mean, certain things will be fair today, it will become unfair, it has to be changed, and so on and so forth. So I don't think there's both are required, but I don't think there's a contradiction. But this worst possible thing is looking at deficits as the sole metric of trade, like Trump does. All his rules are to ease the deficit. Deficits will happen. If you are rich, you will buy more than you produce. If Americans are rich, they will have deficits. Indians are poor, they will have surpluses, etc., etc. So it is part of the economic structure and not related to trade rules. Politics in China, I already mentioned that the decentralization and the governance structure and maybe the efficiency of autocratic regime helps. How do we protect our MSMEs in areas like textiles? Now that is a very important area, and I think that's an area which we can deal through with trade policy. We have basic competitiveness in textiles. It is the second largest employer after agriculture. It needs to be protected. We have a non-level playing field. LDCs like Bangladesh and others get benefits of zero tariffs under GSP schemes. Africans get benefits under AGOA. Vietnam and others get benefits of CPTPP and RCEP. We need a level playing field. So in our FTAs, we need zero tariffs for textile clothing exports. And that has to be a must-have for India. And people are willing to give it because our textiles and clothing are priced. So that is something which can be done. I mentioned manufacturing landscape is fragmented, but the example of autos, where 1/3 of all manufacturing is there, that it can develop. Ultimately, big Maruti set up, and then all the ancillaries came. Hondas and others came there after. So it has to be that kind of a thing, and it can be done. Agree entirely with the person who said that FTA needs complementary with domestic reforms. See, C. Rangarajan, my professor at IIM Ahmedabad, who later became governor of Reserve Bank, used to say that India, we reform only by jhatka. You know, when we have no choice, you reform. It's at the point of a gun. They say, in Godfather, they said, a good idea goes a long way. A good idea at the point of a gun goes further. So that's what we do. But we need to do it, that's disruptive and painful. If we are able to do autonomous reform slowly and steadily, then you can do it at your own pace, and it will be much less painful. Lastly, your point, Dipanshu, the backlash against trade and globalization is real. In Europe, it manifested itself as Brexit, the opposition to imports of manpower from Poland, etc., which were taking away jobs. In the US, it is against steel and other imports from China. The reason for this, and I would go by the work of Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and New York Times columnist, he says trade has been less inclusive than expected and more disruptive than anticipated. Also, the benefits of trade are scattered. 800 million people raised above poverty line, each one goes happy to the bank. But the negatives are concentrated. Cities have died down, people have lost jobs and distress and so on and so forth. Farmers have been impoverished and so on. So the negatives are concentrated and visible, the positives are dissipated. So you don't see them. And it has been less inclusive. The rich have become richer. Rich countries have become richer. Bigger companies have done well. Smaller people have suffered. So there is a backlash against globalization. And my view is that this is a necessary part of change. It will happen. It has to be managed through welfare programs and others. Again, it will be an interim process. Once like an incoming tide, the boats will get lifted, but there will be pain. And if we can minimize the pain, the backlash will be less. Lastly, about services. I mean, so I do not agree that we are a services. Someone referred to India as a services superpower. I think we are a one-trick pony. We are strong in IT services. We are not strong in any other service. Even in IT service, I don't say that we are the best in IT. We are the cheapest. Look at the quality of our websites and our IT work and our IT services, especially public government services. If I have to fill a visa, if someone has to fill a visa form in an Indian website, number of time it crashes, it will go off. If I have to upload a picture, I have to reduce the size, there's no space. Go to the EU thing, you can fill it in 30 minutes. No problem at all. So we are the cheapest, we are not the best. IT services is the only strong point. And in other services, we have a long way to go. So, I hope we reach there, but I think we are long. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I just want to acknowledge, this was also our last in-person event for the semester. Ideas has a pretty eventful semester in every possible way. There was a lot of activities planned for the term. I want to thank Prabhash. Thank you so much for being part of the session and discussion. But more importantly, I think your insights on many issues, I keep reading your work and I think it's phenomenal. I think lawyers and economists need to talk more, which is why the disruptive effect of trade can be minimized, where externalities are better managed. I want to just thank Mr. Deepak for, of course, setting the foundation for what would be, I think, a series of larger conversations and dialogues that ideas would facilitate. One of the advantages of this office is that you get access to the entire university community rather than being restricted under the sort of nomenclature of a school. And I think that sometimes is helpful. I remember a series around trade policy discussions around 4 years back that I had organized because I was teaching a component around it, and that had, without any credits, just people for 3 weeks coming in numbers of 35 to 40 because they were interested to understand what was happening. This is the first Trump sort of attack, and I think there's huge conventional interest in that sense even now. But with that, I'd like to close formally the discussion.